Hello, I'm Matt Silk, and welcome to another episode of the Ethics of AI podcast. The podcast is a production of the Ethics of AI Institute, which has just recently rebranded from the Ethics of AI Society. If you want to look us up, you can check us out at ethicsofAIinstitute.com. Today, we're going to be talking more about the government's AI strategy, and we're going to be talking about the interaction between AI and humanity. And to do that, we're going to be hearing from Kem-Laurin Lubin, who is a long career in the tech sector and in design research, including working for Siemens, Research in Motion, and Autodesk. She recently completed her PhD in English at the University of Waterloo, where her research focus was on computational rhetoric and the link between AI and human-centered design and human identity. Hello, Kem.
Hello, Matt. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me today. It's really good to hear from you.
Likewise. I'm very excited to be here.
Kem is someone who presented at one of our first symposiums, and I remember her presentation was just wonderful back then. So it's a really exciting opportunity to hear from her, and I'm sure she's very excited because she just finished her PhD and she has a lot of new things that she's working on. So you recently defended your PhD, which focuses heavily on AI and human interaction, but you also have a background in the tech sector itself. How can developers ensure that AI supports humans rather than replacing meaningful human interaction?
Wow, yes. So I did just complete my PhD. Yes, it's been a journey. And I think that's an excellent question. It is something that I have been talking about a lot. And incidentally, 2 nights ago, I had the wonderful opportunity to do a lecture workshop with a bunch of grad students in design out of Pasadena, California. And that itself was one of the questions that came up, but through the lens of design. And as you mentioned, I worked in tech for a very long time. And when I worked in tech, it was in the times when human factors and ergonomics were quite central to how we work. So you could imagine each team working as a pod. An engineer didn't work alone. The engineer had to read the blueprint that was actually designed by an interaction designer, and that is what was implemented. But keep in mind, even before that, there was some foundational work done by the human factors team. And those were the people who were kind of a gatekeeper with deep psychological understanding of the impact of technology on the people who use it. So by the time it got to the engineer, that was already part of the process. Today, this is no longer the case. And so one of the things, again, just speaking through the lens of design, which I think by extension can subsume engineers, would be in terms of keeping human dignity at the center of everything we do, we need to figure out a way as to not flatten the end user, the human user. And I can give a brief example just to illustrate what I mean. When we think about the fact that we're no longer just exist as these analogic beings walking around, that we also exist as records and lines in data tables, that is being used to compute who we are. And in doing so, there is a flattening. So when somebody is perhaps labeled something like a high risk in a user interface that was, of course, co-designed by engineers and web designers, we need to be quite cognizant that this is only a representation of a person. And in that high risk category is the losing of some degree of the humanity. So what I've advised from a design perspective, which by extension will include engineering in that specific domain, is that we need to allow for some degree of understanding the nuances as well as transparency to whatever it was that informed a labeling of a human being in that context. So I think without going too far into this, because we really have an hour and I'm sure we have lots to discuss, is I think the big challenge for engineers right now is to ensure that their role in that process does not add to the further flattening of a human being in that digital space. And I hope this answers, and I hope the example was clarifying.
So we're really kind of talking about like profiling, right? When we're talking about data science and trying to figure out information from different people and trying to figure out how to offer them what they want or how to get the most out of these certain kinds of people, right? We're talking about profiling, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is this part of your concern that when we try to profile people into different groups, we engage in that kind of flattening process where we sort of strip people and reduce them. We engage in a lot of sort of reductionism to sort of basic common denominators. Is that fair to say part of what your concern is?
Yeah, absolutely. That is precisely what my concern is. I come from that space. I was very much heavily involved in tech for almost 25 years. And one of the projects, we often have pet names for projects before they actually are seen by the general public. And I remember working on a project where the specific goal was we want to sell software. We want to be able to profile those people who actually bought software. But we have these other people over there who don't buy software. How can we make our software appealing to them? And how do we actually begin to niggle at that cohort over there and flatten them to fit the profile of those who actually buy? And so these projects are just all over the place. They go by different names, but indeed you have named exactly what that artifact is in the corporate space, the tech space. It's called a user profile. And that itself, that user profile is the kind of a ghost trapped in a machine that alongside other ghosts who represent this sort of sameness from those trying to actually sell service to that particular cohort, i.e. user profile. So yes.
So it's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you can kind of understand why this is necessary, right? You want to sort people into different categories for different purposes. But of course, the problem is that once you start doing that, you run the risk of oversimplifying how people work. You can come up with bad conclusions. Various kinds of biases can creep in, or you might just have really bad assumptions about how people operate, right?
Precisely that. And from given my background in design, one of the things I really struggle with is, what other affordances are there from that sense of controls in a user interface and affordance to allow for that, what was then, I guess at this point, an interaction with the user to say, yes, you slated me as such, but might I correct that profile to add that nuance that is critical for me in terms of representing who I truly am? And that affordance has not necessarily been provided for a user interacting in that space. If anything, it's more authorizing to say, yes, I agree, but there's never been that interaction. So in so doing, I do understand the side of the business who is designing the service. And of course, the goal sits within that, in the foreground of the backdrop of, capitalism and extraction and selling things, right? So they need to sell. But in that dialogue itself is really the danger of flattening the human being just to records and profiles.
And we have other questions we'll get to, I'm sure. But so one of the interesting things I think about AI too is that because profiling, and particularly for the purposes of sales, is not necessarily a new concept. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing about AI now is that you can have these kind of opaque models which will have profiles of customers or consumers in ways that perhaps even the developer or the advertiser doesn't fully understand, right? So there's a sort of even stripping away in terms of human interaction, even in terms of just how you're being profiled by another human.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's definitely that layer of opacity, right, that transpires. If you ask tech CEOs and engineers, what is the AI doing? They will tell you they do not know what it is doing. It doesn't really understand what it's feeding from. And right now with AI, it has the ability to amplify and to even get deeper nuances about individuals, their speech cadence, perhaps how they sound and so much more. But, we've sort of opened Pandora's box. And what this allows for is that once this is opened, aided by AI-powered technology, we don't know where we're going with that opacity and not knowing what is happening in that space of adding that layer of artificial intelligence within that context.
So it's even more kind of dehumanizing in a way, in the sense that it's even more just sort of using people as a means to an end, except you don't even fully understand how you're using them as a means.
Exactly that, right? And, I also want to insert him that, AI is not something that is either good or bad, right? It's just how it's used, because that very technology could be used for good in varying contexts. But where we stand right now, the current model is one of extraction, where it is always about how much more can we actually extract out of that end user.
So I think this connects to the next topic and question that we can talk about, because I think this question of profiling is interesting. It's something that has come up in meetings and I think in other podcast episodes too, where we talk about data science and we talk about the idea of understanding the domain in which you're trying to model something, right? And so you kind of really, if you're going to engage in profiling, you really have to have a strong understanding of what it is you're trying to profile. And perhaps maybe that's why there's been such a strong push in AI for the inclusion of people from the humanities, or in some sectors anyways, to recruit people to be able to answer or respond to some of these kinds of issues. You've been a strong proponent of the importance of the inclusion of the humanities in conversations about AI, and you've launched a petition about this. We've also seen some stories of people like philosophers who are in high demand and among AI companies. What do you think the humanities can offer to public discussions about AI, and what humanity should do about AI?
Oh, wow. That is a really loaded question. I want to say so much, but time's flying by so quickly. So I started in the humanities when I graduated in 2001, back in the day, which gives you an indication as to how old I am. I graduated out of Waterloo, and they had an amazing program which was then called Digital Arts Communications. It was a little bit of rhetoric, media. We were allowed to take courses in systems design. So there were a cohort of us who graduated from Waterloo who went straight to tech because we had been primed to work in that space. And in that sense, what I brought along with me as a superpower, as part of that cohort, was the humanities. And let me explain. We often don't think about the systems that we're building is really undergirded by language systems. We're the experts on language, whether it's to persuade, whether there's truth in language, philosophers, etc. And so I think there was a growth period that really mined from that understanding. And I'll give you the one example of, even metaphors. We think about metaphors as just these things, a flowery word to describe something in language. But, when you say something like, the data is in the cloud, there's power in saying something like that. It assumes that this is a vaporous space where it has lots and lots of space to put in, data, but it doesn't really take into consideration other aspects of that. So I say all that to say, up in about 2013, what we saw was a lessening of that energy in the tech space. It became very highly engineering centric. There was no more conversation between designers, especially most of us from the humanities with tech. It's just like we had just been forgotten and kicked out. And so what's happening right now, if you listen to the Anthropic VP or CEO, she has Daniela Amadei, she's basically said that the future is the humanities. We bring so much. I can go into every facet of the humanities, but what I will say to sort of clinch this in a nutshell is that the humanities, we bring the stories, we bring the histories, we bring the institutions that house the archives. I was listening to Leo XIII's encyclical, and just that depth of historical institutional knowledge to know that there was another Leo who said something when the Industrial Revolution was going on, and then we have another Leo saying something in regards to AI. So in coming back from the Federation of Social Sciences and Humanities Big Thinking Conference out in Edmonton last month, I just came from this amazing panel with Jeffrey Rockwell. He's a philosopher over at Alberta, and others. And we just had this really profound moment. And sitting on the plane coming back, I just couldn't rest. And I started just typing furiously, of course, without internet. And I thought, I need to do something. It takes one voice. So by the time I had landed, I thought, I need to put together a petition because we have things to say in the humanities and the social sciences, but we're not afforded that. So when Carney announced AI for All, and I looked at who all represented in that presentation, that's when I actually thought, let me find the tool, change.org, to put out this petition. And the letter is really just making 6 demands of the federal government. And that is really my talk back to Carney's AI for All strategy. And that is really guaranteed representation of humanities and social science scholars on every federal AI advisory body with membership and minutes made public, i.e. transparency. and also funding us. That's another thing, that we're not as heavily funded as the sciences. I went to Waterloo, and Waterloo is a very heavily tech university. We don't get the funding we deserve to be in the conversation, so we don't prioritize it. Also, mandatory social, cultural, and ethical impact access reports before any funding. And coming from human-centered design, any product that we launch started with research. It started with ethnography. I want to also understand the impact that artificial intelligence has had on the worker, the bank on Bay Street, the mom, the dad, everyone. And we have not done that due diligence. Research funding parity, of course, for critical AI scholarship for us is another thing that I'm asking for, that parity. AI literacy programs that teach citizens to question the systems, not just how to use them. And that's something I think you're also going to agree with as well, to being a philosopher, and consultation processes in which affected communities can actually alter the outcomes. And I know that kind of work is already happening with, the Peel region, because I have friends who work, in that general space of facial intelligence and enforcement. And there's a lot of community conversations happening around surveillance, etc. But yes, you can tell I'm very passionate about this, because we are living in very critical times, and it requires that passion to execute what I think is really a critical moment for our spaces, i.e. the humanities and social sciences.
So I think I can talk further about your petition, but we'll do it maybe in the context of this next question, right, which is about the government's of Canada's AI strategy. What is your overall evaluation of the strategy and its ethos, this idea of AI for all? Do you think it misses the mark? And if so, what do you think is the actual most sort of significant oversight?
Well, the good things first. I think it raised all the right issues, things like bias that appeared. I thought, okay, check, they've done that. Indigenous data sovereignty, workers' privacy, transparency, public consultation, and all of that. I thought, okay, yeah, it raised all of these. But keep in mind, I read the world as a rhetorician. And I thought, well, yeah, so what? All of these things were mentioned, but they were somewhat enclosed. And I did not really understand, if I double clicked into what was happening in these things that were mentioned, like bias. That's a word. I need to understand what's happening. So I think that's where I held some issue with it. And so for me, fencing off all of these things without really allowing the public to understand what is happening was where it fell short. Now, I want to talk about one of the things that stood out for me, given my research in ethodic heuristics, i.e. the general space of ethics and trust. So that came up. And at the same time that Bakari was talking about this, I had just been to a CG event where they had polled the audience. I think there were about 1,000 people a couple of weeks ago. And they asked, how many people here use Gen AI? And I would say about a good 85% of the room raised their hands. I thought, this is really cool. Keep in mind, Waterloo is a very well-read city. And then they ask everybody to put their hands down. They ask, how many people actually trust AI? And if 15 or 20 people put their hands up, that was a lot of 1,000. So what it tells me then is that we have a trust issue. And Carney, I think, predicated the AI for all strategy on the fact that we're going to build trust, but does not really get into the crux of how that trust will be built, in an already distrusting society. And
so I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about this, just given your background, because we talked about this issue during our last Ethics of AI meeting, which is that the strategy talks a lot about the idea of fostering trust, not necessarily earning trust. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up having an elongated conversation about what this meant, about the fact that the government wants Canadians to trust AI, but it doesn't really talk a lot about how to earn that trust.
Yeah. And that is what threw me off, because what essentially, if you listen to Kanye, what he's saying is that logically, he says something along the lines that AI benefits AI benefits come from us adopting it, right? If you think about what he's saying without saying it that way, but adoption requires public trust. Therefore, let's build trust. And if you read the sequence of what he's saying, how can we begin to use something that we foundationally do not trust? So then trust becomes an adoption lubricant in his definition, right? And so I also want to footnote this by saying that we're also living in the zeitgeist of understanding that we're being surveilled and that, everybody's aware of the word palliative and they don't know what it is. And that, of course, the Canadian government has pre-approved Palantir's software for citizenship management, things like Foundry and Gotham. And so people are aware that there are cameras around. And so the big letter T, trust, is something that exists that we need to talk about. We don't trust the system. We do not trust it, but yet we're being asked to trust the healthcare app that runs within the system. And so I think that is the trust that needs to be bridged when Carney is talking about AI for all strategy. We need to understand, we need to have a trust in the bigger T before we can actually trust the little t. And so that is what I think the strategy missed the mark on, is not acknowledging the delta between the two.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because it talks a lot. There's a lot about this idea of adoption as a sort of wholesale concept, right? And the economic benefits that are supposed to come with that. But it doesn't say, oh yeah, these economic benefits may come at the cost of an increase in surveillance capitalism.
Yes, that's precisely it.
And so like, and that's fine if that's the choice that people want to make. They say, okay, well, I like the economic benefits that come with that, even if I don't like the costs. But if you're not even going to talk about the costs, it's really hard to foster trust, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there's groundwork to be done, right? And I'm not walking around with my head in the sand, not thinking about the bigger geopolitical situations that we're in, right? We've just experienced the whole kind of a rupture with our closest ally. There are all of these things happening in parallel. Perhaps given that there was a different timeline where this was not the case, AI for all strategy, as defined by Carney, would have been received differently. But this is where we are, and this needs to be addressed and include voices outside of business and tech.
What do you think about, because it also talked about the idea of protecting workers and trying to maintain AI as a means of making workers more productive rather than displacing workers. But I'm not sure if that necessarily jives well with Canada's sort of economic history. How seriously do you take these kinds of claims? Do you think that Canada is well positioned to have AI be integrated into the workplace in ways that benefits human interactions, or do you think it's more likely to be the case that it will just displace them?
Wow, that's a really loaded question. Again, I go back to the point that AI is neither good or bad. It is how we implement it. And I am long enough in this field to know almost 20 years ago, when we tried to introduce medical tools for doctors at Siemens to work in the field, they rejected it. For them, it was an interjection into their normal flow. Fast forward now, 2025, 2026, my take on it is that I think there's lots of good stuff that AI can do and help humanity and human beings with. For example, things like skin cancer detection, right? AI is really super good at that. And so that is something that aids a human being in a specific specialization. But when we employ the rhetoric, as many of the tech leaders have, to say that, AI is going to replace, what people hear is something completely different. And so the whole framing of artificial intelligence as this super amazing thing that is going to replace people, I think is the false start in the rhetoric that has made AI feel so off-putting. As well, too, there are far-reaching consequences for that in the context of work. When you decide you want your employees to use AI, who's getting assessed at the end of the term? Is it the person alone, or is the person using AI and learning, how to use AI? So there's so many more questions. Going back to Carney, there are also questions about, like, what are the laws and guidelines around employment law when somebody, for example, beginning the process, uses AI to assess resumes? Not even going further back, when somebody submits a resume that was generated by AI and it is submitted and disposed of because it was generated by AI, the hypocrisy. So for me, I think Carney also misses the mark on really understanding the life cycle of what it means to work. While you're in your job and you are being displaced by artificial intelligence, who's gonna pay the bills in that time? So again, I think from my research head perspective is that we need to be able to bookend the beginning and start of the implications of people within the context of work have to face with AI in that flow. And there are different tracks. There's some good things that it can help us to do, but also some bad things. And that is why I think the AI for All strategy also missed its mark. So, when we double click into any of the words that he alluded to, whether it is work, I don't know what else he said at that time. It sort of escapes my mind this moment. It's been a while, but we need to be able to double click to understand what lies beneath the hood of the rhetoric that he's actually put forward in the AI for All strategy.
It's interesting, right? You mentioned even something like using resumes, like using AI to look at resumes and stuff like that for hiring, and again, if you're applying to a job and you're not sure, for example, if that AI, if you can really trust that AI to really look at your resume fairly, again, that might be a big issue in terms of people's willingness to trust AI in Canada. And yet, looking at the strategy, right, the question of certification is only mentioned twice in the whole document.
Yes. And, I love to give people grace, Matt. And, I'm giving Carney grace in the sense that, this is a once in a lifetime transformational piece of technology, and he has to say something. My problem is that the people informing the strategy are not necessarily the people who should be informing the strategy, which goes back to the humanities. We know best about people, not the engineers, right? Not the business people. There is a built-in incentive for them. Of course, the engineers within their own survival story are building the tech. So yes, we need to understand. We need to understand that a little bit more fully from a humanities perspective.
Okay, so looking a bit broadly beyond just sort of the government's focus on these issues, right, in terms of the larger public conversation, what do you think is the biggest concern about AI that the public conversation overall has largely overlooked?
The on-the-ground impact of everyone. I live on a street with a lot of people with degrees who have either been let go, laid off, or what have you. And there's an AI story embedded in all of that. I think what I would love to see, if you recall, maybe you're not as old as me, but there was a time that, the city nurse walked through door to door. I want to understand the impact of the collective. I also want to understand how they feel betrayed by the current moment that we're in. So from a research perspective, I want to see impact on the ground impact report in varying communities that feel that they have been impacted by AI, and also to understand what we're going to do about it as a community.
In terms of the profiling issue, right? Like, do you feel like the public generally really understands that kind of, because to some extent it's a kind of statistical thing, right? And again, how well do people sort of really understand this stuff in practice? Do they understand that they're being profiled in a sort of statistical way, right? Like that's obviously a concern. And then on top of that, you have, as you mentioned, right, people being let go. You have increasing kinds of like animosity, I think, like increasing tensions where humans are sort of conflicting with each other over different approaches to AI and what their approach to AI should be. So yeah, it's interesting, right? When you start really thinking about like how these things affect people on the ground, right? Like at a ground level. Are people being well served by some of these systems, and how well do they really understand these issues?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have a long way to go in terms of literacy, right? And so those really who are charged with the governance of what literacy could look like around artificial intelligence. Again, it is not just about the use, but also really understanding that this is a non-sentient entity that we're dealing with as well, too, and teaching people to think critically about that interaction. the one thing I also want to mention is that indeed there is a divide, right, in the whole AI narrative. There's some of us who see doom, there's some of us who see boom, right? And there are way too many who are in the doom category than those who are in the boom category. And we need to somehow figure out how we're going to bridge that divide between those who are benefiting from it versus those who are just really suffering under artificial intelligence, or the perception of being under artificial intelligence and control.
So quick question though, just because I also work in the issue of AI literacy. What do you think is the most, if we're talking about, making sure that people have AI literacy, what do you think is the most important thing that people should have if they're AI literate or no?
Wow. I don't know that I have an answer, Matt, and I don't even know what literacy looks like for general consumption. I know what it looks like for me. It's knowing when and when not to trust this entity that I might be interacting with. It might be different for somebody in kindergarten versus somebody in grade 12 versus somebody who's 50 or 60 and technically inclined, etc. So there needs to be an understanding of what literacy means and what it means to specific groups of people interacting with it, but also contextually interacting with it. I think about the craziness of perhaps having somebody working from, say, a healthcare perspective, who we often say human in the loop, who looks at this and think, okay, yeah, the AI said it, so it must be right. Check, process, right? So we need to be very particular about the word literacy. It needs to be contextualized on so many levels. And I think that is the task at hand for us in terms of deciding who needs what so that we can engage with it. Because AI itself is not just one thing, right? It's many things. And it means different things in different contexts.
One final question for you. You're an organizer for the Global South Summit, which focuses on AI development in the Global South. And there are many concerns raised, everything ranging from environmental factors to the cultural impacts. How do you think nations in the Global South should respond to AI development?
Critically and with deep regard for sovereignty. If that is the short answer. So yes, so this summit was started as a roving summit in 2024 when I was there for a conference on the island of St. Lucia, and we people presenting, and there was not a lot of conversation around artificial intelligence, my presentation and one other. And so understanding that the Creole Heritage Month, and French Creole, was being held in October, a group of us decided we must do something. We have the power and the network to do something. So we put out spider webs, and we were able to attract 167 people, including school, and that is not including the many schools who sent students to the event. The Prime Minister gave the keynote. We had wonderful convergence of people from academia with the public, with varying industry. And I thought this is the kind of a microcosmic view of what I would like to see at a different level, where we have all voices talking about this. We had people from the archives, the librarians, we had philosophers, and it was somewhat, sponsored and brand by the University of Waterloo. And so we had that warmth around us to say, yes, this is something we needed to do. And so this is what we're hoping to do this October here in Guelph. It's going to be a one-day intentional conversation about, again, trying to recreate that convergence. And just a footnote, when I say the Global South, for us, it is not a geographic location, but rather a condition. And so the Global South is in the Global North. So what we hope to do is to bring that conversation and to invite people to have these conversations, not just because you work in tech or you're a professor, but because it matters and it has some degree of impact for your life.
Okay, well, this has been a great conversation. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you over the last, last hour or so.
Likewise, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Although, as you know, Matt, I can probably go on and on. I just think it's just one of these things that, yes, I'm happy to be given the opportunity to encase a bit of that conversation with you.
Yeah, it was a wonderful conversation, and I don't think I'm spilling the beans too much to say that you're going to be joining our group. So we'll probably be hearing more from you again. We might have another opportunity to chat. So just to reiterate, joining me today was Kem-Laurin Lubin. She just started a postdoc at CG, right?
That is happening in a month and a half. Yes, soon.
I want to thank her again for joining me today. I'm going to make sure that there is a link to her petition in the description. So if you want to sign her petition, you can. I'm Matt Silk. I'm your host today, and you've watched another episode of the Ethics of AI podcast. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.